Also speaking, we've got Katie Freeman, Rachel Buckby, and Lynn Revell. And I just want to give a shout out to Rachel because it is her wedding anniversary today. Um, I'm very grateful that Rachel is choosing to spend her wedding anniversary with us in this way. I think I'm going to assume that everyone's here. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Just bear with me a moment. And when I do so, in recognition that yesterday when we put up that first slide, that there's a real diversity of people in the room, teachers, advisors, academics, all kinds of people here. And that freedom of religion or belief may be a concept we're assuming that is new to many people. It'd be really helpful if in the chat people are able to just sort of say, have they engaged with FoRB before in the work that they do, the work that you do? And as a follow-up question, particularly for teachers, be really interested to know if any teachers on this call work at schools or have worked in schools that were or are rights respecting schools. That's mainly for me, it's a curiosity question, but it'd be very helpful to know. Right, I'm sharing my screen now. Just bear with me. Hopefully. Oh, oh dear. I'm not being allowed. Right. My screen sharing is not working, so I'm going to just talk rather than trying to pull this up. Before we get too far, I just want to get some things just set some very sorry, now slightly flummoxed by this, but there we go. Right. Freedom of religion or belief, FoRB. What is it? In simple terms, FoRB is a human right. It's part of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's Article 18. But the rights that are protected under FoRB are also protected by other national and international instruments in the UK. For instance, the Equalities Act, internationally, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. These are instruments which are protecting the rights which are covered by FoRB. And just to spell it out in very plain terms, Article 18, what does it say? That's from the Article 18 from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, says that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in community with others, and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance. So this is, if you'd like, the bedrock, the ground from which a great many decisions and policies have emerged. But a really important idea to stress as we move forward through this conversation is that FoRB protects the person and not the religion. And for me, what's interesting when I think about that is the parallels with a religion and worldviews approach, in that it centers the individual rather than the religion. One of the key texts that emerges over the last 30, 40 years in terms of FoRB and education was the Toledo Guiding Principles on the teaching about religions and the Toledo Guiding Principles on teaching about religions and beliefs in public schools, which was published about 30 years ago. And at its core, that document, which was published by the OSCE, the Organization for Stability and Cooperation in Europe, sets out two principles. Firstly, there is a positive value in teaching that emphasizes respect for everyone's right to FoRB. And secondly, that teaching about religions and beliefs can reduce harmful misunderstandings and stereotypes. And this is where we start to get to the point at which these two threads, FoRB and education, specifically religious education, begin to knit together. Can specifically religious education be a space within the curriculum in which FoRB and FoRB principles are promoted and in which children can learn about them as well? At Culham, we've been thinking about what FoRB education might look like. And we undertook earlier this year a review of the landscape of the FoRB and education landscape. And what we set out to do as part of that was to try to identify characteristics of FoRB education. And we came up with 4 principles. And they are that FoRB education should include explicit articulation of human rights as a concept, and that choosing, changing, or leaving a religion or belief system is captured by human rights, and that there are documents, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights being one, in which those rights are articulated. So firstly, FoRB education needs to include opportunities to engage with that. Secondly, children should have an opportunity to talk about concepts of freedom. Thirdly, children should have an opportunity to talk about their beliefs and to think about how they might differ from other people's beliefs. And finally, FoRB education should present an opportunity for self-reflection and for the development of critical thinking skills. I present those 4 principles there is no hierarchy there. It's just the way, that is the way that it is written. Now, in our research, we found very few examples of FoRB education anywhere. There are some in the UK, and I'm delighted to say that Culham is supporting a primary project, and we're going to hear from Katie and Rachel, who've been involved with the delivery of those initiatives. And secondly, REAC, their Young Ambassadors project, is focusing on FoRB. Internationally, there are other examples. Hardwired International, who are an American NGO but working in the MENA region, have been doing some interesting work in this space. But there are also, we would identify, FoRB adjacent education, and we include things like citizenship education, dialogue education, interfaith education, anti-religious hate education. So I'm going to finish up and pass over to Katie. But before I do, I'm just going to leave you with a proposition that we at Culham have been working on. And I invite you to reflect on that proposition as you hear from the others and think about it in the context of your own work as well. And our proposition is this: high quality religious education can only be taught in an environment where FoRB principles flourish, and that for FoRB to be promoted and protected requires that children have access to high quality religious education. I can see there are some things in the chat about the slides. I'm going to put those principles in the slide, and I'm going to put the proposition in the chat as well. But with that said, I'm going to hand over to Katie to talk about some of the great work that she's been doing in schools. Katie.
Right, I think I'm hoping that you can see my slides. Can you see them or not? No? Yeah, you can. Brilliant. So I'm just going to open up the screen. I don't know. I think, Josh, there's a little technical difficulty we've got here. So I'm just going to talk to you briefly about my school's context. So this is my school, Bickley Down, and we are in a little outskirts of Plymouth, it's in the South Ham, so it's just before you get to Dartmoor. And it's in a little place called Walwell. There's quite a lot of land around the school. There aren't, Chris Giles often, I don't know if he's in the session, but he often tells me that he expects that I've got a tractor outside my school when I leave it. I don't. I like to say I don't have a tractor outside my school when I leave it. But it is fairly rural around the area, but it's about a 10-15 minute drive into Plymouth city centre. It's not overly diverse as a school community, but it is fairly diverse for the area in which it's in. And the children have kind of a very in-depth understanding of different religious and non-religious worldviews. We recently had an Ofsted inspection where the Ofsted inspector said that he'd never been to a school where children have such deeply rooted knowledge, and it's not just scratching the surface, they really do understand it. But so we kind of have been looking for different things that we can do in RE to really get the children to understand about that lived experience. So when Catherine and Josh sort of got in touch with us to talk about the idea of working on this FoRB project, we were really, really interested. So we've done several projects with Culham. One was with foundation stage, but the one I'm going to talk to you about briefly was in year 4. And we started with our children by looking at the census data, because I think they need to know that their lived experience is not the same as other people around the country or indeed around the world. So we looked at the different communities of religious and non-religious people that lived around our school to find out who they were and how close to the school that they were living. We were studying a unit called What Does It Mean to Be a Hindu in Britain Today? And we really wanted to look at this idea of what does it mean to be free to live out your worldview? And we wanted to get the children to think about, are Hindus living near to the school, near to Woolwell, free to live out their worldview? We used the census data to get the children to have a really firm understanding of who the people were who lived in the area, and also what the places of worship that we had in the local area were, and if they were reflective of these communities. Now, our nearest mandir to Woolwell is 45 minutes away in Oakhampton. It's not a traditional looking mandir. It is in somebody's garage. We talked about how many Hindus in the city, we had some interview quotes and things from local visitors who've been into school previously, worship at home. But if you wanted to go to a mandir, what does that mean to you? Are you truly kind of free to live out your religious worldview? And what does it mean for travelling that far to go to a place of worship and meet with other people in your community? And what does it mean if that mandir has kind of worship practices that are different to the ones that you want to use? And we also spent time talking to the children about big celebrations for Diwali that happen in London and Leicester. And we talked about why this doesn't happen in Plymouth, and was this fair? And were Hindus living in Plymouth truly free to express who they were? We used some case studies. So we looked at Rishi Sunak celebrating Diwali on the steps of 10 Downing Street at the time. And then we looked around to find places of worship, and we looked at historical data for Plymouth about the Blitz, and we talked about why it's difficult to find places to build new big places of worship in the city, and why many religious communities use converted buildings. And we spent time designing new places of worship. We talked about whether there should be one in Plymouth, and then we looked at whether or not these communities were free to live out their worldview. This led to some really, really interesting discussion with our children, and they were quite incensed that places like London and Leicester, they felt had more freedom for those communities to live out their worldviews. And we wrote letters to our local council to highlight this as an issue and to put their RE learning into practice. So I guess you're probably thinking, what does this mean? And how does this kind of help children to kind of understand these communities more? We know with the religion and worldviews approach that we're looking at starting with people, starting with those communities. But I think the children had this idea that that human right of freedom of religion and belief was about religious and non-religious people kind of I guess being locked up for things that they believe in or didn't believe in. And they hadn't really thought about that concept of not being free to practice in the way that you want to as well. And that led us on to have quite a debate about whether that was part of the human right as well. It's really, really kind of engaged the children in deep conversation and deep dialogue that I don't think we would have got from a sort of a normal, so to speak, RE lesson. And I think we're now using FoRB across our school as a lens in RE to get children having those discussions about the human right of freedom of religion and belief. So I'm going to hand it over to Rachel now, who's done a similar project to me with different outcomes and a different context.
Thank you, Katie. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Hopefully. Right. Can you see my slides okay? Yeah. So I'm going to talk for the next few minutes about how I've gone about, as part of the project, integrating FoRB into RE lessons in my classroom. So first of all, a little bit of context, I work in St John the Baptist Church of England Primary School, which is a large multi-faith, multicultural school on the edge of the city of Leicester. There are both 3 form entry school, and currently I'm teaching in year 6, which was where I sort of carried out my focus. So all 3 classes took part, but I sort of focused particularly on my class. So my sort of question that I was focusing on was looking at how FoRB could be incorporated into RE lessons, sort of, and using a religion and worldviews approach to learning in RE. So sort of like methods of research and tools that I used in the classroom was pupil interviews, and I had a focus group. Thinking about initial thoughts on FoRB from pupil interviews, and then after each lesson interviewing my sort of specific group of children. And then sort of after the final project again, doing a final interview with those pupils, observations that I made during activities and during their conversations and discussions. And sort of like, while I was carrying out this, sort of reflecting on the steps that I took and the processes that I took in planning the unit of work. And then sort of a discussion around FoRB and questions and reflections linked to RE tasks that they carried out. So a unit of work that I chose to focus on and adapts from the Leicestershire agreed syllabus on why do some people believe in God and some people not, and sort of look at we apply a FoRB lens to this unit of work. So we looked at with pupils at the FoRB principles, and then sort of looked at using a FoRB lens, what questions could we ask about FoRB relating to those principles, and pupils created magnifying lenses that they then sort of wrote questions that they could ask about those 4 principles, and we then kept those lenses so that they could use them throughout the unit of work as a prompt when we were looking at case studies and different activities, that they could refer back to those questions that they thought about, and they could add to those as well. We used some case studies and also sort of lots of discussion around FoRB questions and reflections linked to RE tasks. So the first lesson involves thinking about how a FoRB lens might help people interpret data about people who believe in God and people who don't believe in God. And for each lesson, I also took sort of a FoRB focus as well from work that Josh had done with Catherine on sort of setting out for different age groups FoRB related foci. So there was a FoRB focus, and this FoRB focus was children having some understanding of their role, of the role that everyone can have in promoting human rights and developing that sort of wider human rights vocabulary. So we looked at, for the first lesson, we looked at changes in data from 2011 to 2021 and the census, and did a particular focus on Leicester. And it's getting the children sort of like, what do they notice? They did sort of like some predictions as well on how they thought things might change. And then what did they think might have influenced these changes? And then could they use any of their FoRB questions around those changes? And we also looked at the definitions of atheist, agnostic, theist. And they talked very much about actually people could change their mind. So somebody might be a theist and then move to being an agnostic, or change between faiths, or people might be atheist and then become a person of a particular faith as well. So they were very much sort of engaging in that conversation about changing people changing their religion or their belief. Moving on to the second lesson, we sort of looked at how we might use a philosophical lens to study the question, is God real? And again, children having some understanding of the role that people can have in promoting human rights, and also using wider human rights vocabulary. And also pupils were encouraged to go home and have conversations with people at home about their beliefs, whether they were sort of theist, atheist, and reason or agnostic, and reasons why people held those beliefs and those views. And we did quite a lot of work on continuum lines and positioning different statements. And again, the pupils use their FoRB lenses to reflect on people's reasons around their thoughts and their beliefs. Then moving on from that, pupils have collected some of their conversations, notes from people at home, as well as using some resources from within the syllabus. And again, more continuum, thinking about the most and least persuasive arguments that people might have for somebody to change their faith or their belief, or to convert or to lose or to change, and then thinking about how that relates to FoRB, again looking at their lenses, and also looking at case study. We're using the FoRB lenses, so they used those when they were reading case studies. They would use their lenses to pick out key parts, and looking at whether within the case studies freedom of religion or belief had been upheld and people had been allowed to have their right of their freedom of religion or belief and practice their religion or their belief, or whether there had been any violations. And then moving on, thinking about what impact does believing in God have on how people think and live, and the ways in which fundamental rights associated with religion or belief might be violated, and knowing how they and others might experience violations. Another resource that I used was the Amnesty International At Your Street resource, which people spent time looking at what do they notice, what do they think is happening, and then again finding images within the picture that they could they relate to FoRB. So there's lots of them investigating, and then some questions for them to discuss and think about and reflect on about. Do you think everyone should be free to believe or not? If someone thinks there is a God, is it their right to persuade others? Why not? And if someone believes that there is not a God, is it their right to persuade others? Why and why not? So just some final thoughts from the pupils and myself. They had a good understanding of FoRB, and I think somebody had mentioned in the chat earlier about actually FoRB might be happening I guess incidentally. When Kevin, in the first part of the project, which is pre this, Kevin came to do a discussion with my class, and he did said, they get it, and whether it's like FoRB actually is incorporated as well, within the values within the school and the ethos of the school, as well as through doing something specific through RE lessons. They talked a lot about personal choice of religion, non-religious belief. They still tended to refer to religions, even though I did my best to mention or belief, and to try and move them away from it being religions. I don't know whether that comes from being a church school, but I did my best to and belief, emphasizing that it doesn't have to be a religious belief, can be non-religious too. The fact that FoRB responsibility lies with, felt that FoRB responsibility lies with leaders of countries, school heads, parents, but also actually every individual has a responsibility too. And they were talking about protection of FoRB, the people having a right to refuse if someone tries to convert you. And they did talk about that people actually they're aware that people do to try and convert other people, and that those people have a right to encourage people to share their faith, talk about it, but actually don't have that right to force anybody to believe. And then they felt it was really good to put yourself in other people's place and look at things from their viewpoint. Pupils had no previous experience of work around FoRB. They found some of it quite confusing to start with and a bit long. SATs got in the way and interrupted my series of lessons, but they felt that a spiral curriculum of lessons would help, which is something that I perhaps plan to develop in our school. But they very much enjoyed the tasks that I'd included and seemed to get a lot from it. So I'm now going to hand over to Lynn.
Hi, thank you very much. I come from a slightly different perspective because I'm working in a university and at the moment mainly focused around working with student teachers, student RE teachers, or student teachers that will hopefully be teaching RE when they go into school, and also doing some research around freedom of religious belief as well. And I think, like everybody else that's spoken so far, my commitment to freedom of religious belief is very much entangled with a worldviews approach. And I think I'd probably go as far as to say that I don't think worldviews as an approach in school to the teaching of religion and belief can be really genuine and authentic unless it is intimately bound up with freedom of religious belief. What I wanted to concentrate on in the few minutes I've got is just to look at some of the barriers and challenges. I mean, the speakers so far have given really brilliant examples of how you actually do this at the chalk face. But I do think there are some real challenges out there, and we need to be able to acknowledge them, get our heads around them if we're going to take this area further. For me, the very first challenge is around content that we have at the moment, particularly when you look at many of the agreed syllabi. Yesterday, Gillian Giorgio was talking about the fact that we have a very content-led curriculum. And what that means, just on a very mundane level, is that there is no space. There are not minutes in the day to be able to work with children on the kind of philosophical, political and cultural sensibilities and the legal issues that people were raising as well, that underpin freedom of religious belief. There's no place, there's no time for the kind of reflective dialogue that you would need for freedom of religious belief to become meaningful when we have a curriculum that is so heavily prescribed by content. The second challenge is that often that content, not only does it take up airspace in the classroom, but that content is very often presented normatively, which means that there are baked into that content certain views and values which we present to children as objective facts, or they assume they're objective facts, even if the teacher is not arguing that. And therefore, they're not even aware that there are alternative expressions or alternative interpretations. Yesterday, I went to an excellent session on homosexuality and GCSE. And Emma Sauter, I don't know that she's in the room, but she made the point that she didn't think that, there you are, Emma, hi, that you didn't think homosexuality should be a controversial issue anymore. We're in the 21st century, why are we still talking about it as a controversial issue? And while on a personal level, I agree with that, in the classroom, if we argue that, that raises all kinds of questions about freedom of religious belief. Because what about those views and those religious beliefs that don't have the same interpretation of homosexuality? So it might be problematic for us, but I still think that we need to ensure that when we are, the content that we cover in classrooms, that we guarantee that children are aware that there are multiple interpretations and multiple ways of understanding that information. And the final thing I just wanted to talk about was I've been trying to talk about freedom of religious belief with students at the university for some time now. And the last students I taught basically said to me at the end of the unit, we agree with everything that you said, and, it looks really great. But how do we actually do this in the classroom, in the sense that they weren't asking for how to teach it, but they said, are we allowed to do it? Are we allowed to raise these kind of issues in the RE classroom? And they very much had a sense that that they wouldn't have permission to do this. I'm not sure that this is just a Kent thing. I come from Canterbury and Christchurch. And I'm sure it's experienced elsewhere as well. So what I tried to do this term was essentially understand freedom of religious belief, not as a particular set of lessons or values, but as an approach. And I think people, kind of embedding it into the fabric, not just of your RE lessons, but of the school. Gillian said yesterday that worldviews is an approach. It's not a lesson plan or a scheme of work. And I think that a commitment to freedom of religious belief is also an approach. And what I've been trying to do this term is actually model what I think that approach could be. And for me, it involves listening, it involves acknowledging and engaging with as many different voices and leaning in to the complexities and the frictions and the contradictions. And if you like, putting those at the center of almost everything we teach. So when I do a session on adaptive learning, or when I'm doing a session on the mosque, my starting point is not what do children need to know, but how do they need to know this, or how can they know this in ways which will open up the tensions and the different types of questions and interpretations, even to the extent that, I think, Katie, you were talking about, I think it was you, Katie, you were talking about, the human rights legislation and a human rights approach, to the extent of talking to students and possibly pupils that a human rights approach itself is a worldview that others would reject, and raising the kind of meta question, is it legitimate to argue against that? Obviously, that's a very big can of worms, and it would depend on the age group. But I think unless we're happy to have that can of worms in the room, we will be doing freedom of religious belief a disservice.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Thank you to all the people that have spoken so far. We're going to move to a time of questions, and Josh and I have got a couple of questions for the four of us to kind of answer. And while we're doing that, it would be really helpful if you have any questions for any of the people that have spoken so far, if you could pop those questions into the chat. And Josh and I will keep an eye on those questions and try and raise as many of them as we can before 12:30. So I'm going to move to the first question for Lynn and Rachel and Josh to kind of talk about. So I guess we've heard lots of different ways of doing these things. We've heard about the challenges. We've heard about what freedom of religion or belief is. But why should schools do this? And why does a FoRB lens add value to the RE classroom and the teaching of the subject? So I don't know who would like to go first, but I'm going to just invite you just to turn your microphones on, and then if anybody wants to sort of start that conversation, that would be brilliant.
Shall I go first?
That would be great, Rachel. Thank you.
So why should schools do this and do FoRB, and what does it add? I think children have a real interest in human rights. The two classes that I've sort of carried out this project with have been really invested in human rights, and I think it links together sort of that study of religion, that diversity of religion that the worldviews approach brings, and lived experiences of people. And actually, I managed to find there's a St Philip's Centre in Leicester that do lots of sort of interfaith work, and they produced a booklet called Living Well Together. And I found an example, sort of like a case study that I could use with my class. And I think because it was so local, it was really interesting, and they found it really interesting. So it was about a bus driver who, a Sikh bus driver who'd got a job driving one of the buses in Leicester, but he'd been told he couldn't wear his turban to drive the bus. And actually, the people that he was staying with at the time fought with him and supported him, and this was overturned. So he ended up actually being like in the Midlands, being the first Sikh driving a bus driver. And I think that just sort of brought it to life, to that actually there were these problems around where in Leicester, where we live. And it just, it makes it relatable to them, I think. But
I think what you just said is really important.
Stories.
Yeah, and when we were doing the project on the first year, we had, so one of my classes was a foundation class, and one of the other teachers was working with a foundation class, and we found that a lot of this was very sort of innate to the children, wasn't it? They just felt like, well, that's the way it should be, and they should be allowed to do these things. And it was quite a realization to them, or revelation to them, that at 4 and 5, that actually some people might prevent other people from living freely and living out their religion or their belief. And as those year groups have got older, and I think it's been particularly obvious with the work you've done with your year 6s over the last 2 years, that it's been really clear that the children have taken that reactive interest in those human rights and what they mean, and how they feel that those human rights need to be defended as well, which I think has been particularly powerful of the children's voices in your work, hasn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Is anybody else? Josh, did you want to add anything, or Lynn?
I think freedom of religious belief has always been important, but I do really think it's of particular relevance now, and there's a particular urgency to talking about it now, because I think, there are quite a few narratives within wider society, outside of the classroom, outside of schools and education, around what we can say in a public space, around a whole range of issues, whether it's gender, race and ethnicity, religion or faith or personal freedoms. Some of these are directly related to the classroom, so like the prevent duty. There's a well-charted chilling effect that is happening within schools. There's lots and lots of debates around freedom of expression within education context. And basically, I think it's never too soon to start raising these issues with children, because they won't suddenly become literate at 18 when they become adults, unless we can flag up those issues and give them the language with which they can disagree or agree. And at the current moment, I think it's never been more important.
Yeah, I agree. And I think also starting with very young children as well,
Yeah.
4 and 5, a language and kind of the use of those concepts that are appropriate for them is really important. So I don't know if, Josh, at some point you might be able to put the link to the document that we wrote about working with primary school age children on work to do with FoRB, and how we did that with the younger children in foundation stage. It might be really interesting as a bit of post reading for people in the session to find out about as well.
Absolutely. At the end of the session, I'm going to put a link to all the pages on the Culham website. Very briefly, I'm going to add, why apply a FoRB lens? Why is this a good thing to do? Well, I think, at risk of, I'm not a teacher, so I need to put that up front, but the innovation and the passion that the RE community shows in terms of, the application that it makes, that you all make, is amazing. And I think that what I've seen over the last couple of years, listening to teachers who RE teachers, is that this work has been happening. Engaging with FoRB is not a new thing, and someone's pointed that out in the chat. The innovation is taking place on a daily basis in classrooms up and down the country, and it's amazing. And there is an opportunity, I think, for the RE community. This is one of those products, if you like, that the RE community can be really proud of in terms of really innovating when it comes to human rights education, specifically FoRB education. It's not happening anywhere else, as far as I'm aware, in the world, quite honestly, at the scale in which it's happening in RE classrooms here. And I think it's something that we, and you in particular, should be really proud of. So that's why I would apply a FoRB lens. It's something that the community can be really proud of. I'm going to move swiftly to the challenges, if I may. And I've noticed that there are questions coming through, but what would anyone like to talk about the challenges of applying a FoRB lens, and maybe, whether it's at a kind of a framework level or within the classroom? What were some of the challenges that you've found coming through? Lynn, you've already said a few things about challenges, so maybe Katie, Rachel, you might want to speak to classroom.
Yeah. I'm happy to sort of talk about it. I think I was quite initially in the first year when we did the project, before I worked with my year fours and I was with the foundation, I kind of thought, how are we going to do this with really young children? But I think I found that stories were definitely the way in. So using a story to kind of generate a discussion, but also how much of a response throughout the primary school we would get from the children linked to this. I didn't need to worry. And I think that the challenge was more, for me, really, was more about kind of just making sure that the planning allowed for it and just being conscious of kind of reviewing that and making sure that I hadn't missed anything. And I think that's why working with Culham on the project was so helpful, to kind of get that second set of eyes on the work that we'd been doing. But to be honest with you, I feel like, why wouldn't we do it? And I think what you were saying earlier, Josh, about how, like, you know, that we're doing it all the time anyway. I think that one of the challenges is that teachers think it might be another thing to do, but actually they're not really aware that they're already doing, and it's just being aware of what it is that they're doing already in the RE classroom.
Thank you. Rachel?
So yeah, I think for me, sort of some of the challenges were finding sort of like age-appropriate resources, and also sort of handling some of the violations, where in perhaps particularly if we were looking at sort of examples from different countries, that we weren't making those stereotypical as well, that this is an example of what has happened, rather than this is what happens in a particular place. But also sort of like when I first started working on the project, and was looking for stories and things, and I think it's sort of like, as I've done the project, sort of like my understanding of FoRB has grown, and perhaps my sort of openness to sort of see things in the news or people post and think, oh, actually that relates to FoRB. So just having in my own head my own knowledge and awareness of freedom of religion or belief, has sort of given me sort of like more sort of snippets and samples that I could then add into lessons. But yeah, sort of like it was quite hard to find resources initially, and I think sort of like as a teacher, it's another thing to try and get your head around as well. So I think, and sometimes at that time, but it does fit really well. So yeah.
Thank you, Lynn. Any challenges that you feel you want to flag? And I'm just conscious of some of the questions that are coming through, and whether you might want to pick up on some of the challenges which are emerging in the question. So, for instance, you know, the prevent has been mentioned in the chat, and, you know, controversial issues in the classroom. How do we, you know, the challenges that teachers and schools face in terms of opening spaces for challenging conversations in the classroom? Wonder if you want to pick up on any of those in your reflections about challenges.
Sorry, my microphone on. Sorry, yeah. I had a discussion with Nigel Fankel a couple of weeks ago, who spoke at the conference yesterday around law. And he was saying that he found it amazing that there are, and I can't remember the exact figures, about 650 pieces of legislation that affect the teacher in the classroom. You know, obviously that's a huge amount. And I'm willing to bet that the vast majority of teachers, and you know, it's certainly true of myself, we have no idea what those pieces of legislation are. But we do know that quite a few of them give us rights as well as moderate what can be said in the classroom. And so maybe one starting place would be to educate teachers and student teachers about what our rights are, you know, let alone us talking to the children about them. Do we as educators know what those rights are? And I think, you know, when I was talking to my student teachers, I think that they would have been much more emboldened to experiment with some of these things in the classroom if they had a really firm understanding of what their legal rights are, and therefore what the rights of their children are. And in terms of challenges more generally, I think there was a tendency, and again, obviously I'm just basing this on talking to my student teachers, when we first started talking about freedom of religious rights, their first instinct was that, yes, we support freedom of religious belief, but this is something that happens elsewhere. This happens in underdeveloped countries, or this happens in countries, Muslim countries where there's a theocracy. And it was quite an eye-opener for them to begin to understand that actually it happens rather closer to home as well. And that was a moment of kind of cultural disjointure in some way.
Thank you. That's really interesting. In the interest of time, we're going to start heading to the questions in the chat rather than our third question that Katie and I put together. But I'm going to working from the top. Is that all right, Katie? If I go from the top of the list,
sounds good.
So there's a question that Kate Christopher asked, and I think links well with the one under from Jane Yates about, why the value of FoRB and why now. I wrote down. But I think it would be too often teachers are excluded, senior school leaders are excluded from policy conversations about issues such as FoRB, and I think that it would be fantastic to get more teachers to conversation with policymakers to explain the curriculum in real terms. And to show how a FoRB blend and teaching about FoRB within the context of an RE classroom promotes and protects FoRB principles, which this government ostensibly and previous governments have all signed up as being that they're committed to. So I think that yes, in some respects, it is there's a kind of it is about a lever on which the RE community can pull to raise the profile of the subject. But equally, there is real value in and of itself to communicating about what's going on. Katie, have you spotted the next question going down there?
I was just going to add a little bit to what you were saying, if that's okay. And I think it was also, so not this year, but the year before, when we went to the party conferences to represent the RE Council and NATRE, the conversations particularly that we had at the Conservative Party conference were surrounding the politicians really feeling like they wanted to hear from teachers, they wanted the voice of the teachers. And again, when we went to the Labour Party conference, it was the same thing, that they recognised FoRB as being important, but they recognised they were having conversations between ministers, and that they wanted to hear about how that looked in the classroom. And certainly that's been a real sort of plus of the project, I think, that we've done with Culham, Josh, when you say, is that, our voices have been heard and our children's voices have been heard about why this is important and the difference that it makes. So I think it is important for policymakers, but I think it's also been a really good example of opening up those conversations between schools and policymakers too. I'm just having a scan through this chat. There's so many questions that it just keeps jumping.
I think there's something about senior school, the school leadership, which I think I wanted to pick up on. So in the chat in a moment, I will stick the links to the Culham website where there are various reports that have been written, and there will be forthcoming reports, and hopefully we're doing some resources and more on this field. But one of the things that came through the reports, I think quite strongly, was the need for in our pilots, for the teachers, Katie, Rachel, and others, to engage A, with their senior school leaders, and B, with the wider school community, parents, in terms of laying the groundwork for this, in terms of making sure that people understood what was going to be talked about in classroom and how it was going to be talked about. And I wonder whether Katie and Rachel, in particular, you might want to just pick up on that, because it does feel like there's quite a strong pulse of that coming through in the chat in relation to how do you have these conversations as a school community? How do you tie it into school values? I don't know who wants to pick it up first.
I'm happy to say a bit and then give Rachel a bit of a breathing space and she can chip in. I think it has to be a whole school kind of approach. So when we've done it, we did it as like a little mini research project with our youngest children, and then we looked at how that might look within a unit of work as a lens in RE. But it wasn't just a case of me going into the RE classroom and teaching a series of lessons. I think that it has to go through everything that you do. When you look at your vision and your values of the school as well, the children, because they know those so well, will automatically make links. So I'm on the SLT at my school, so it was a conversation that we had as an SLT about the research project that we were doing, the work we were going to do with the children, how that would look, and then how that linked with, all schools under the old Ofsted framework. We were looking at British values, and the children made really clear links to that. So when teachers are teaching about British values within their PSHE lessons, we made sure that there were some links going on talking about FoRB and the importance of it. But the children often made those links too. So I think it's about whole staff awareness, and it not just being stuck to the RE classroom or the RE department, whether you're in a secondary or primary school. I think there's got to be a firm understanding by everybody in your kind of setting, really.
Thanks. Rachel, anything in terms of senior school leadership?
Yeah, so I'm not on senior leadership at my school, but the head was really supportive of me taking part in this project. And actually, when we had Ofsted, it's been last couple of years ago, she was very keen, sort of like when she was needed sort of like support on what comments and things for the personal development section of Ofsted. And so she called me into a meeting then, and sort of like when she was asking the question, I'm like, well, FoRB covers that, and FoRB covers that, and FoRB relates to that. So I was able to sort of give her my folder of FoRB work so that she could then use that in the meeting. And Ofsted were really impressed with sort of like what we'd been doing. Very much our school vision encompasses that, and our school ethos, and again sort of like our school values of that sort of respect, integrity, sort of all those. Much we sort of like the values of our school are lived out in what we do. So I think sort of again pupils were able to make references to our school values when we were doing the work on FoRB. They'd be all like, that comes into our values of respect, and these people need to be respected. And the head, although sort of like I focused on my year sixes, the head is very keen for me to roll out some of it across the school. So.
Fantastic. I'm really sorry to keep going with the questions, but I'm really struck by Alexis Stone's question, and I wonder, Lynn, whether you want to speak to this. Is FoRB a value of the RE teacher? Yeah. And I wonder, in your experience of working with trainee teachers, whether you can speak to that question. Is FoRB a value of the RE teacher?
I don't think it is at the moment, because I think very many RE teachers, for understandable reasons, are committed to the presentation of religion in the classroom and worldviews in the classroom, which is based around respect and mutual understanding. And I'm not for one moment advocating that we shouldn't have respect and mutual understanding. But I think if we place those at the centre of our identity as religious education teachers and at the centre of the RE classroom, that problematises more controversial, or not even controversial, but alternative voices. And I must admit, that's one of the things that I love about the world views approach, is that whole side of worldviews that looks at the different disciplines and the different types of knowledge, because simply by moving in different types of disciplines, it allows us to ask a far wider range of questions, which can be more disruptive, if you like, of traditional narratives. And I think a good example of that is around fundamental British values, because on the one hand, fundamental British values are lovely, but on the other hand, they're deeply problematic. And for me, in a FoRB classroom, you would be able to problematize those values, or show pupils that they come from a particular political and social interpretation. Obviously, not a key stage one, but it's definitely, there's an approach of just questioning and recognizing the sheer diversity of views that there are, even in a society like ours. Starts young.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I mean, I'm minded to ask a follow-up question, if you don't mind, Lynn, in terms of how do we support you in your training with teachers entering into classrooms to embody, to lean, like to find within themselves, because I'm assuming that, you know, it's there. It's not that they're not able. It's maybe it's a confidence thing, that they feel that they can have these conversations. What needs to change to support teachers entering the classrooms in your experience?
I think partly it is a confidence thing. And I think that that's probably our job at the university, in part, to build on that. I think providing resources is an absolutely essential thing, because they, at the end of the day, they have to, you know, new teachers are terrified anyway. They've got really good resources to lean on and build on in the classroom. But I think the bigger thing is you need permission to take these risks. And I think that permission will come from school leaders. It will come from us within the RE community. But it will also come, I think, from the agreed syllabi. The agreed syllabi at the end of the day is the last word. And if that last word is not fully committed to FoRB, in a curriculum that's unbelievably crowded and all the other pressures that there are, FoRB will get lost. I mean, we know that. So I think the agreed syllabi have got to walk that walk with us.
Thank you. Katie, have we missed any questions? I'm struggling so much with content in the chat.
He's jumping so much for me, but there's one that I thought was quite an interesting one about which disciplinary lens we think FoRB links with. I think I'm gonna be really bad and say what I think. I'm not sure it fits with a disciplinary lens. I think my personal opinion is that it's a disciplinary lens in itself that might sit with another one within a study in RE. I don't think that we want to box it up with another disciplinary lens. I think it's something in its own right. I am happy to be wrong.
I agree with you, Katie, because I used it as a sort of like lens on its own. It probably links with human social sciences, but actually I wanted to keep FoRB as a lens itself, as a way of looking at RE.
And it might sit, mightn't it, alongside like a historical lens, like when we were looking at, you know, why we've got certain places of worship in the city and we haven't got others. When we look at the Blitz and the rebuilding of the city, and it might sit along a kind of sociological lens of looking at census data and who lives in a city or in a community. But I think it needs to be something in its own right.
Brilliant. I feel completely overwhelmed.
Another hour.
Unpack things slowly. I feel like we're just skipping around. Maybe because I am struggling with this chat. Should we do our final question as a kind of
okay.
We've got 3 minutes to go. Katie,
so the final question is, if you had one wish that could be granted linked to FoRB, what would you have happen?
FoRB education, though, I think.
Yeah, FoRB education. What would you want to happen? It's a big one.
Shall I go first?
Yeah, I was going to say, you look like you're ready.
I sort of did narrow it down and think about in my own particular context. So for me, my wish would be for me to have time to embed FoRB. As my children sort of said, they would have found it easier had they had some learning about FoRB before 6. So for me to sort of implement that across my school, from foundation stage, Key Stage 1, lower and upper Key Stage 2.
Yeah, I think mine would be very similar to you. I think as teachers, we always want a little bit of time just to kind of make sure that we've got things, and then just spend time reviewing it and making sure that it's as good as it could be. Josh, Lynn, do you have any reflections on what your wish would be?
I'm not quite sure I've got a very defined wish, but one of the things I do find frustrating is that there's lots of talk often about how the snowflake generation are really sensitive and they don't like challenging issues and they're easily offended. And they don't really want to engage so much with things like freedom of religious belief because there's potential conflict there. And I'm not sure that's true. But there's no data out there that really tells us how the younger generation are really engaging with things like freedom of religious belief. So if I could have one thing, it would be a much better understanding of where we are with the young people who are going to be the next generation of teachers around these issues.
I think that's really interesting, Lynn, because I think you're right. There's often like a generalisation that sweeps in, but actually sit them in the classroom or I don't know, in a lecture theatre or a group to have a discussion, and it's really active, but they need to be given the opportunity as well to have that time
and the permission to be able to explore those ideas.
Definitely, yeah. Thank you, Josh.
Very quickly, and just building on that, really, and not to instrumentalize the RE and the teaching of religion and beliefs, but I think I suspect that we're all in agreement that the RE classroom is an amazing space in which really complex, meaty issues that children care about and adults care about too can be and are being explored, and yet it remains such an underdeveloped area of the curriculum, under supported, and to get some people into those classrooms who really care about those big issues, to see what's going on in RE classrooms would be a really powerful thing. I think we're about to disappear.
Thank you very much to everybody who's taking part in the discussion.